Alright, so this is an update on the Airline radio basket case. Just a quick one, really. I managed to squeeze in some time to work on it, and we now have the chassis and the tube sockets rust converter primered. Great stuff, and we've got this inside and out on the chassis. But importantly, I left all the original solder blobs with the ground connections in place. I taped over them so that when I go back to actually stuff everything back in here, I have a good solid ground point to work from instead of having to cut through paint and everything. Now it was suggested that I use a cold galvanizing compound to work with this, and I did consider it, but cold galvanizing stuff is relatively expensive, and also it tends to result in a kind of a dull gray color, which is not what I really want to go for. I'd like to get the shiny cadmium plated look, which is why I use a sort of a bright aluminum paint for it. And while I'm sure that the cold galvanizing would work really well on things like tube shields, it just doesn't have the right aesthetic. You know, at the end of the day, there are always ways to get good grounds even when you've covered everything up with paint. So we've got that all set. We've got the tube sockets all nice and done up. So those will sit back in place, and eventually they will be reattached with screws, nuts, and star washers. Get a good bite. And I'll make sure we have good electrical connectivity between all the metal parts. Make sure all the screws and everything fit nicely. One other thing, I did manage to get the power switch on this cleaned up. Let me grab that. The power switch was pretty badly stuck. It's a wafer type. Get this in closer here. But what's interesting about it is because this is a battery set, instead of just having a single position that connects like the A battery, we have to connect the A, the B, and the C battery all at the same time. So what they did was the positive connections all go to the respective points of the set, but all the ground connections actually have a common connection. So we have this ground wire here that I'll eventually reattach to the inside of the chassis. We have this central rotor, which has a common connection, and then these three guys here are A, B, and C negatives, and they all go to the same points. When we flip our switch, we complete our ground connections for all three sources. Very simple. And this took a little while to clean up, but I got everything working. I'm glad I didn't have to replace it, because probably wouldn't find another one of these anytime soon. And I've also been working on getting the shields cleaned up. These are a little bit more difficult because the plating on these was still pretty intact in some places and resilient. But after soaking them in Crud Cutter for some time, I started to get that off, and I started to get a decent base to work with. Now this one, I think I actually had enough stuff to get the inside as well. I had to kind of roll it around in the solution every half hour or so to get it. So this will probably take a few more tries. This one I didn't have enough left over to get it fully dunked, so I'll have to get some more rust remover solution. Unfortunately, acetic acid in the vinegar is just not strong enough to really remove the plating and everything. You need a harsher chemical, something like phosphoric acid, to really strip that off of there and provide a good base. And then I can apply my rust converting paint, throw some primer on there, and all that good stuff. And then, of course, we still have the tuning capacitor to clean up. And I haven't gone any further on this yet because I still got to buy more of the solution. I got to get paid first. But the other thing is I need to, in order to actually clean the condenser, we're going to have to remove all three of these small mica trimmers up here. And I'm not going to remove them until I've cleaned their terminals, and I got to take it to a lab and hook up an LCR meter and check what the capacitance of each one of these is, as a reference so that when I actually put the sheets back in, I can set them back up to roughly where they should be so that the local oscillator and everything has the same value as before. Otherwise, aligning this set is going to be an absolute nightmare. Now, thankfully, there isn't a whole lot of problems mechanically. Yeah, it's a little scratchy, and I might have to do a little bit of adjustment on the plates because it looked like we might be making some contact on that first section, but these are screwed in place, top and bottom, so if I have to get them aligned a little bit, it's not impossible. It's just not particularly fun because the tracking might get messed up just a little bit. But that shouldn't be too hard. And once I have the mica out, then I can dunk the whole thing in a solution and get all the oxidation off of it. Once I do that, though, I'll probably try to just hit the outside up with some clear coat. I don't really want to paint this. I mean, I suppose if I taped everything off correctly, I could probably paint the metallic surfaces, but I only want to do that if what I remove is rusted plating at all, which that would be ideal. But if I can just get the rust off and try to preserve whatever remainder of the metal finish is there, that would be good too. So we've got that to deal with. But the next step here is I am going to be throwing on the first layers of aluminum paint on this guy. So that will be our next step. So I'm back to working on the Airline battery set that I've had sitting around for a little while. The chassis has actually been completely painted and is ready for reassembly. I've actually got the switches back on it, but right now what I need to deal with is the last of the rust removal. So we've got the two IF can shields here, we've got the tuning condenser of course, and then we've got the two tube shields, all of which are rather crusty. These guys I already gave an initial bath with my crud cutter, and it didn't do a bad job, but I really want to get everything as uniformly clean as I possibly can, and especially with these, they originally all plated and fairly shiny aluminum. Some of the plating is still in there, and the crud cutter that I ran out of was doing a great job at removing it, but they don't sell it in large enough quantities at a decent enough price for me to want to buy, like 15 bottles of the stuff just to keep cleaning all of this. So instead I went down to Home Depot and I got this stuff right here, which is labeled as a non-acidic, it's just supposed to be ecologically safe. It doesn't have anything in there that will harm plastics or rubber or whatever else it says on this blurb on the side of the deal. And it has some pretty decent online reviews, although they do say the working time is a little bit longer than other acid-based things. Like the crud cutter is phosphoric acid based, and this stuff, it says while it's being used, it can be reused if you filter it. So I have a spout, and I'll have some filter material that I can run the stuff through after I've done things like this to keep it and put it back in the bottle. It says the particles of converted rust will cause the fluid to turn black, and you can filter this out and all that good stuff. Now for the first round, I'll only be doing. I only have so much space in this little glass container I'm using at the moment for experimentation, so I'll do, like these guys first, see how that works, then I'll dunk these. And then tomorrow at school, I've got to run some simulations, so I'll be taking this tuning condenser in and testing these three capacitors at the top of the assembly here before I remove the mica sheets and disassemble them for cleaning. You don't want to get the stuff in there and screw that all up. And I also need to remove the remnants of the wires at the bottom. I already have their positions labeled and ready to go. And I've already got new chassis grommets installed for those threads. So, next we should hopefully see some clean metal to work with. So despite everything else I've been working on, I did in fact have time to continue on the disaster that was the Airline battery set chassis. And as you can see, the whole thing's been painted up, got rust-proof primer on there, did over with an aluminum coating, and it came out pretty good. I mean, you can still see there's extremely heavy pitting all throughout here from the rust damage. I wasn't going to go into it like trying to Bondo it up and make it perfectly flat and anything. No one really cares. be perfectly honest, neither do I. But I've got the first two tube sockets back in, and I also have the tube shields painted up. Now, I put these through that new rust remover converter junk that I've been trying out, dipped the tuning condenser in it as well, and it does do a really good job of removing rust. However, because it doesn't use acids, it won't remove platings. So I re-dipped the IF cans, and there's no noticeable difference. However, there you can see there's visible pitting at the bottom where the rust was the worst, but the rust is all gone, nicely cleanly removed. And I hit up this guy here with semi-chrome polish to get the surface as shiny as I could manage. I wanted to try and avoid to paint absolutely everything if I could help it. And I think these are in good enough condition where I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to polish them up as best I can, and then I'll put a coat of clear enamel, Rust-Oleum clear enamel on them to protect the surface. And that should work well enough. So we got those all done up. The controls on the front are back in place. The wire wound volume control is in place and tests good. The power switch that was rusted up is all working fine, still working fluidly. And I've also very slowly been working on getting the electricals all reassembled. So we bring the light over here. I just started with getting the switches in, and then basically everything that was away from the tuning condenser as best as I could, because that takes up a fair amount of space, and getting to those screws before you put everything else, like the transformer that goes here, both the intermediate frequency coils. In fact, this guy over here is the antenna coil. I'm sorry, the intermediate frequency is the back one. So this is the antenna, and then you have the oscillator coil here coupled to all of that. So tuning condenser will go back in. I've got rubber grommets installed. The whole shape on those was actually an elongated circle, really. So the grommets fit kind of sort of okay in there. It'll be interesting to see how the tuning condenser wants to squeeze back into those. I may have to try something different to get it to fit right, but hopefully shouldn't have too much of a problem. Got this adjustable capacitor reinstalled in the back here with some new wire. I am saving what original wire I can, like obviously the oscillator connections, like the coils and all of that, and some of the inter-socket connections here I'm leaving original. But the vast majority of it, the power connection and battery wires especially, are all being replaced. The school actually, their computer lab had an absolute ton of junk Corsair power supplies, some cheap 450 watt deals, and they were all junk apparently. So I asked if I could have them. They assured me, what the hell, they were just going to recycle them anyway. So I yanked them, cut all of the motherboard and header wires off, and I've got a whole freaking box of it now, and they still have more power supplies to use, and it's good wire. It's stranded, got a good number of colors. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of stripe variation. You only get yellow and black. You've got some blue and maybe a little bit of green in there if I'm really lucky. But enough variety that I can replace most of the wires I've had to cut for reference, like these blue connections here and this yellow here. I can at least replace it with a close simile. However, for the battery connections and like for the antenna and ground I'm leaving all black. I probably could have done something a little bit different, but I didn't have any other colors except for yellow at the time for the antenna. I can always change that if I want to. And then the original battery cables actually had these nice little, I'll have to try and hold that up here. They effectively have a little stamped or crimped on identifier tag. That's not going to focus all that well, is it? No. Well, I'll just take my word for it. So you've got this one right here is for 67.5 volts, and then you've got the B minus connection, and you have the main B plus connection for 135 volts for the plates. So those, I saved all of those, and I'm going to do the same for the A supply and then the C supply, although one of the C connections was cut so short that the original band was lost, which is unfortunate. But I can always make something later, maybe get one of those wire label kits and just slip something on it. But it was nice to have these. In order to actually get them fit onto this smaller gauge wire, the insulation is not cloth, so the actual conductor is about the same size, but the insulation is considerably slimmer. So I had to put some heat shrink tubing over it and re-crimp in order to get them to actually stay on there well enough. And then, just like the originals, the wire bundle is knotted to prevent it from being pulled out and away from the socket and causing damage. And in terms of the sockets, I figured out how to get them relatively well cleaned up. There was some junk on the surface of the material, though. This is phenolic, and for a while I thought I accidentally hit it with a wire wheel and cleaning the chassis and had screwed up the surface. In reality, there was just some caked on crud that I couldn't get off with isopropyl alcohol. So I just took a box knife and carefully scraped it away and got all that off there and then cleaned it over. Some of the numbers on here for the tubes, the paint has faded, so I'll just get some white modeling paint and I'll carefully fill those back in. I've actually done that before on some electrical plate brass badges that originally had white insert. It actually works really well. Let it dry for a little bit to wipe off the excess and it still leaves a nice impression. You can also do the same thing with markings on like antique firearms, although some people don't really care for that all that much. So the next thing I'm going to do here is get the tuning capacitor set back in it, and then I can start working all the electricals, and that actually turned out really, really well. So the tuning cap was immensely dirty. I mean, I'll have to do a before and after photo comparison once this thing is reassembled, but I was looking at some of the first photographs I took of this thing when I got it, and it still impresses the hell out of me at the amount of difference that there is. And this came out of that bath, that chemical bath, really, really nicely. Now there is some on the plates, especially. These were originally plated. I don't know what they were. Usually these are made out of stamped aluminum, the fins on these. So there's what looks to be a little bit of aluminum oxide on the surface or something along those lines. I can't really do much about that. And there's pretty severe pitting all throughout here, but the rust is gone. And I gave a soap and warm water bath to ensure there weren't any oils or anything left on it, and just generally got it clean. And I tell you what, the fluid that I put in there for the chemical bath was perfectly clear when I started. In like 30 minutes after I dunked this thing in there, it would turn a fairly solid murky brown. It was pretty disgusting. But when I pulled this thing out, there was no remnants of any crud left. And in fact, it cleaned the bearing out so nicely that I could spin the fins up and down. In fact, if you just flipped it over, they fell open, which is fantastic. I have actually, there's only one ball bearing in this end of the rotor, and I've gone ahead and put some lithium grease in there to help that out. Don't really want to do it at the other sections because those are electrical grounding points for the blades here, or for the fins. And then I also went ahead and I polished up the tuning assembly at the front and repositioned what's left of the dial pointer. I think someone actually broke off that. This originally had a curved style dial that was pretty typical on cathedral sets and such from the early 30s. You see it a lot on like Atwater cants, and a lot of other the Los Angeles based radio manufacturers tended to follow the same design aspects as far as aesthetics go. The last thing I have to do though is I need to take this back to the lab, and probably had that out of shot for a while there. I need to reset all of the capacitors up here back to the values that I found them at initially. Got the mica sheets back in. I'll have to bring this back to full open so that the main part of the condenser doesn't interfere with these values, and then I get that set, and then once I do that, I can plop it back in and get her set back up. And to that end, I already have brand new ground wires installed where the originals were, and I've cleaned up the 3 terminals at the bottom in preparation for reattachment to the rest of the circuit. So that is all well and good. And that's just about it, actually. Once that is installed, I can just go gung-ho on reinstalling the remainder of the parts. The one electrolytic capacitor that this thing needed and has, it only has one electrolytic. It's a 4 microfarad 200 volt that actually goes down here in parallel with this 0.1. Already got that on order, and I have more than enough of the other values that I need to finish reassembling this. And yeah, hopefully I still have to build a power supply capable of providing the bias voltages and the B pluses, but I'm sure I can figure something out. But yeah, I am really happy with how this has turned out so far. I did have a bit of a stroke earlier. I was looking at my schematics that I'd drawn from the underside of the chassis, most notably this wonderful doodle that I did, and I suddenly realized that I hadn't remembered to note the position of the antenna coil up here. I wrote down the colors of all the wires. However, the tuning capacitor has two connections from this coil, and they're both the same color. And I didn't really note a difference in length or a position on the coil, because the coil has 6 some odd studs and they aren't all used. But I was able to pull up the schematic on Nostalgia Air and trace it back based on the resistors and capacitors that were on the coil, and I was able to solidly identify those two, so disaster averted in that regard. But yeah, tuning condenser, then I'll install the 2 transformers, get the IF back in, get the antenna coil back in, and then work my way from there. There are some of the connections for the tube sockets and for the speaker socket that I'm not going to disconnect. I think they're filament connections, actually, that are twist wound, and I want to keep that because the way the wires are routed on radios like these is generally very important. There's not a lot of shielded connections. There's very few shielded connections in a lot of these radios. You might see some in like a Zenith or something for audio passing by another section, but yet I'm trying to make sure the wires go the way they were originally in here when I do replace them, just in case. But that is all for now.